Hello and welcome back to my channel. I'm Bob the Bookerer, and today I'm back on my usual nonsense and I am looking back over a Booker Prize shortlist, in this case 1973. So you may notice as we kind of go through this, there are only 4 books on this shortlist. The 70s seem to sort of play around a little bit with the idea of what a shortlist should probably look like size-wise, and they really varied. So 1975 there were only 2, but then we get to 1980 and there are suddenly 7 on the shortlist. So nobody could really decide at this point, and there are a few factors that kind of went into this, but either way there are only 4 to talk about on this one. And we see at this point in 1973 J.G. Farrell win for what at the time was his first win, but he would later be given a second win with his previous novel Troubles, which won the 1970 Lost Man Booker Prize, which was kind of lost because of a change in the rules, meaning that essentially there were some books that were released in 1970 that were then no longer eligible because they essentially were from the previous year. So this whole sort of section of books got kind of lost out. Anyway, that meant that J.G. Farrell had his second book in the trilogy, his sort of Empire trilogy win, which is Siege of Krishnapur. I didn't necessarily get on with this book as much, and as you'll sort of see when we come to kind of to the end of talking about all these books, wouldn't have been my choice for the winner. But essentially, Siege of Krishnapur follows a group of British army men and kind of sort of other people who have been moved out to India during the time of the British Empire there. And they are kind of living in this kind of, you know, rather comfortable life in many ways, at least sort of financially, in a position of obviously power and influence. And what's really interesting in some ways about this book is, you know, it was kind of obviously, you know, being released in 1973, that's a peak time where the British Empire was in decline, where lots of nations, quite rightly, were seeking independence from the United Kingdom and from the Empire more generally. And this is kind of something that we see quite a lot in a lot of fiction, you know, from the 60s and 70s. A lot of books that come up in Booker Prize shortlists around that time also talk quite a lot about Empire, because it was kind of the thing. That was, you know, in the same way that a lot of fiction in the US sort of post 9/11 tries to deal with what that looks like for the country. The loss of Empire to Britain was seen as, you know, a big sort of talking point and a big point of discussion. However, I think that's also where part of my issues with this novel lie, because I find it quite problematic in parts. I do wonder if for 1973 this you know, would have perhaps been less problematic, but essentially, you know, there is a strong note through the novel of being critical of Britain's role in India and Britain's empire more generally. So, you know, there is one character who keeps on saying that he thinks rebellion is coming and nobody listens to him. And ultimately there is a rebellion against British rule, and that kind of results in, you know, quite a lot of violence. And, you know, the key point that is there at the end of the novel is that some of these characters still go on to have normal lives and think about kind of, you know, they still want to kind of basically get shuffled into various other similar roles in other empire countries at the time. And so there's this almost this idea that, you know, some of these characters have learnt nothing from this whole thing. They haven't come to the end of this sort of you know, rebellion and thought maybe we're the bad guys here. And so, you know, in that sense, there's a really, you know, valuable critical point being made in it. For me, I think part of what I found a bit tricky and a bit problematic with the book was maybe that the Indian characters are given there are Indian characters who speak, which is, you know, A+, you know, they're not just spoken about, but they are given this really kind of hackneyed, stereotypical kind of bad English, which, as much as there may be some accuracy in the sense of, you know, this is, these are people who, for whom English is not their first language, it does also feel strange that we hear from them and we're kind of they're set up to kind of be poked fun at in some ways, that their English is a bit bad and characters like, oh gosh, why can't they speak like us? And I get that there's a political point being made behind that, but it feels a bit uncomfortable, and that's kind of where I find it a bit difficult with this book. That aside, you know, there are some really interesting, great moments. I preferred Troubles by J.G. Farrell a lot more. I found that was a lot funnier and a lot more interesting, whereas I don't think I could really connect to this book. But I can totally see why, particularly at the time, that would have been seen as the winner, even if I don't agree. And it's another interesting case for me of how some of these books are really of their moment, and, you know, at the time, no other book could have been chosen to win, in some people's minds, perhaps, other than, you know, Siege of Krishnapur, whereas actually years later I don't think it necessarily holds up, at least for me. I was looking through Goodreads. I like doing this when I've not really gotten on with a book, or even if I've really loved it. I love kind of reading the opposite opinion on Goodreads, and sometimes I kind of learn something more from it that gives me a newfound appreciation for the book, or makes me perhaps focus in a bit more on some of the critical aspects that I hadn't considered. But with this book, yeah, it was interesting. People were talking about, you know, the use of voice and the fact that he is quite critical of empire, and that comes through in various other parts. I just think perhaps it wasn't for me. I don't find it that exciting reading kind of details around battles and war a lot of the time, and I don't know, it didn't appeal. Anyway, I'll stop rambling on that, but it's you know, that was then the winner, and that also now means that J.G. Farrell is technically, you know, one of the only two-time winners of the Booker Prize, after his 1970 win as well. Next up is Beryl Bainbridge with The Dressmaker. Now, I've spoken a bit about this book in my Booker Prize Icons video about Beryl Bainbridge, which has absolutely appalling video quality. So if you do need to, it's got my face very close to the screen. So if you do, if you do need to watch that, or want to watch that, and feel the need to like not look at it as you do so, please be my guest. I should probably remake that or resubmit it at some point, just with less of my face. But yes, The Dressmaker. So this is concerned with this group of working class women who work around a factory, and is just, for me, so full of why I love Beryl Bainbridge. It's so funny, and she's got such a great sense of voice throughout. So you've got these really kind of chatty characters who are just sort of living their best little lives. It's kind of set during the war, and these women are kind of trying to chase down husbands if they can find them, or are just sort of trying to live this kind of really quite hilarious little life. You know, they're obsessed with this idea of American GIs. They think that they will kind of save them. You know, they want to find themselves a nice man who can look after them and rescue them from drudgery. And they think that because they're American, they're all super fun and exciting. Although this isn't my favourite of the Beryl Bainbridge books I've read, I still just think this is such a fun book. It's really short as well. It's quite a short list as it goes, not only because it's only 4 books, but also because, you know, a few of the books are kind of under 200 pages. And then Iris Murdoch comes along and writes over 400. But I really enjoyed this book. For me, The Dressmaker is just such a good sign of who Beryl Bainbridge is. Like, these really funny characters who just quibble amongst themselves and bicker, and it still ultimately has, you know, some really important points to make about women's role in the war, all of those kind of various other aspects. But apart from anything else, it's just really funny and heartwarming, and I just adore this. I just think it's really fun. Yeah, and it's really good to see this in this shortlist. You know, we've actually got 3 quite heavy hitters, as it were, in kind of British literature, in terms of Iris Murdoch, Beryl Bainbridge, and J.G. Farrell. Elizabeth Mavor wasn't, I don't think, as big, but, you know, did have some success with another book as well. Anyway, enough about that. So we come next to Elizabeth Mavor with her book, The Green Equinox. I didn't really know what to make of this book. It's actually as well one of the rarer ones. It's a lot harder to track down than some other Booker Prize books. Some shortlists I'm finding, you know, there are some really big name authors like Beryl, Bainbridge, Iris Murdoch, and it's so easy to find their books because they've been reprinted several times, and you know, even if that specific book that was shortlisted isn't one of their bigger, you know, well-known ones, it would have been reprinted because of the author it's attached to. Elizabeth Mavor, with Green Equinox, it was really quite hard to track down. I had to kind of get it shipped over from another library, and even then I was sort of seeing people online who lived outside the UK being like, when am I going to be able to read this? Don't know how. But yes, it's a really short little novel. It's kind of hard to describe in some ways what's really going on. There is this sort of main character, Hero Canal, who seems to basically be in love triangles with pretty much everyone who exists ever. There is a sort of a typhoid outbreak, which ends up sort of adding some sort of humour and silliness into parts of the tale, because these lovers are all then sort of connected by this typhoid, or kind of worried about it. There's also kind of these people trying to stop trees from being cut down and kind of protesting around that. So there's a lot of like quite strange stuff happening throughout the book. And I think what's really fun and engaging about this book as well is how Elizabeth Mavor does this kind of some of the language is so in-depth and almost over the top with kind of how elaborate and florid and kind of verbose it is, and then she'll throw in swear words, and there's something so satisfying about that contrast of, you know, describing this really just sort of describing all this porcelain in very sort of technical terms, and then describing one of them as being C-word shaped, and it kind of comes out of nowhere, and you're like, Elizabeth, like, what are you doing? But I really enjoyed it. I don't really know. It's weird, after finishing it, I'm not really sure how I feel about it. I mean, it's literally sat there staring at me, actually, as I'm sort of looking at the camera. But I kind of don't know how I feel about it in ways. It's a very strange book. But I think it's kind of a fun addition to the shortlist. I love when weird and wonderful books that you wouldn't expect end up in shortlists like this. Particularly as this book as well for the 70s would have probably been quite forward in not only the kind of use of language, but also in showing, you know, there are quite a few same-sex relationships and discussions of them, and there's a character who they sort of flippantly describe sort of towards the end as probably having some homosexual tendencies, and things like that. So really interesting, really fun, and it's just great to see a book like this going to make it in. I kind of am intrigued to go and check out, is it Ladies of Llangollen, I want to say. Yes, which she was probably better known for, it seems, which seems to be non-fiction. But anyway, it's well worth checking out, and I'd love to know people's thoughts if you have read it, particularly as it is such a different book for this kind of list. And then finally we come to Iris Murdoch. So I mean, this is only what, like by this point the fifth year of the prize maybe, and this is Iris Murdoch's third shortlisting. She was very prolific, as I'm finding, kind of looking back, and you know, it's interesting seeing descriptions of Iris Murdoch's work and you know, the Wikipedia page saying things like, this was Iris Murdoch's 23rd novel, and like, crikey, all right. Not Bruno's Dream. That is a different shortlisted novel of hers. The Black Prince by Iris Murdoch is the final book on this shortlist, and I adored this. So this book is all around, it's focused on the idea of an unreliable narrator who is a writer himself, and he gets kind of caught up early on in a number of issues and kind of problems and crimes. So for example, he comes over to someone's house after someone has been attacked and they fear that they've been murdered. He also then starts a relationship with a woman, a young woman who is the daughter of a kind of rival kind of person. Then there are all of these other descriptions. There's a male character who is in love with him, and there are sort of assumptions throughout. Iris Murdoch, I've noticed, does sort of seem to pepper her books with a few gay male characters. There always seem to be a few kind of just sort of lingering in the background or kind of made quite overt. And here, the man who is in love with the narrator, or at least seems to have some sort of feelings for him, is convinced as well that the narrator must be lying about some issue, some parts of the story, and must be telling the truth about others, because that would confirm parts of their love in his mind. So essentially, this author, all the way through, starts. It's written in a very writerly style, in the sense of it's very formalized. It's this writer almost trying to convince us and argue with us that he is in the right. And what is so fascinating about that for me is that it really portrays this character as being so kind of he's so convinced that he is right, and he's really trying to convince us, so much so that we start realizing how unreliable he is. And I absolutely fell in love with this book. I read the last 300 pages pretty much in one evening. I was just like, I am so in this, I'm just going to do it. And we get kind of a sort of prologue that kind of describes that we are reading an editor's view of the work. Then in the epilogue, we get kind of these various postscripts from various characters within the book, and then it's kind of up to us as readers to start working out who is telling the truth and who isn't. And almost all of the characters in this book have a real vested interest in their side of the story being told. And so suddenly we've got this really interesting moment where we want to believe the ex-wife because her stories corroborate a few other things, but at the same time she has a massive vested interest in passing herself off as this very sort of lordly, kind of brilliant, clever character, and we kind of think that maybe she's wrong. And so I find it absolutely fascinating, and think that this book just has so much going for it. It's so deep and rich, and it's what I'm kind of starting to... This is only my second Iris Murdoch novel, and I'm starting to kind of see and almost expect from her now. You know, she's very clever. There's almost always a philosophical argument. She was a philosopher as well as a novelist. There's almost always a philosophical argument at the heart of the novel that she's kind of trying to unpick and describe. And here we get this really strong sense of what is reality, what do we remember, what is the truth, and kind of unpicking like this. I just absolutely adored it. I thought this was really fun, and such an interesting book. And so overall, those are our 4 books. This is really quick. As you may be able to tell from me gushing about it, for me, Iris Murdoch, The Black Prince, was the winner here. This is the book that I would have hands down chosen as the winner. Perhaps as a runner-up, I would have had Beryl Bainbridge with The Dressmaker. It's a fun little shortlist, this. All British writers. I mean, I think J.G. Farrell is Irish, I believe. So apart from J.G. Farrell, everyone on this shortlist is a British writer, and so that's really interesting. This is kind of early days of the prize, before it had opened up to, for example, writers from the US or from other parts of the world. So we do often see as well, especially early on, that you might get the occasional South African or Canadian or Irish writer, but very rarely an Indian writer, especially in the early 70s. But overall, you tend to get mostly British and Irish writers, and yeah, kind of as a result, I do wonder what books would have made the list had things been a bit more open. The 70s would have had a lot of really big American names kind of coming to the fore, so perhaps that would have been the case instead. But overall, I just think this is quite a fun little year that has really forced me to look at books that I don't think I'd have read otherwise, particularly in terms of ones I didn't like, perhaps like Siege of Krishnapur, but also books that I would have really enjoyed, that I did enjoy, that I wouldn't have known about otherwise. So I probably wouldn't have really zoned in on The Black Prince by Iris Murdoch. I wouldn't have tried something like The Green Equinox by Elizabeth Mavor, and I also probably wouldn't have spent as much time with Beryl Bainbridge. So really fun little list. If you've read any of these, I'd love to hear your perspective, especially if you have strong opinions on Siege of Krishnapur or A Green Equinox, because I realise that those are the books that are probably less known. Sorry, I mean, Siege of Krishnapur is quite well known, but that's the one I didn't get on with as much. But I'd really love to know some of your thoughts. Let me know, and as always, take care and enjoy your reading, and I will be following this up with some more Booker Prize shortlists before too long, because that's what I do now. I've I forced myself into this, and there we go. No, I am enjoying this. Anyway, take care, and I will hope to hear some of your comments. Have a great time. Bye bye.